All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you. Get settled. I can tell we have others than Episcopalians in the church because we have people sitting in the front of the church. And the Episcopalians always sit in the back, so that's nice. I want to welcome you on behalf of Father Ricardo Bailey and Father Adam Shoemaker to St. Mark's Episcopal Church, our three churches united tonight. And we are so pleased that Kevin Sack, best-selling author and author of Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church is with us. Thank you so much, Kevin. I've got to say, I've got to mention this out of the box. I mean, but for just maybe pure chance, we could be here discussing your new book, Calvary Episcopal Church. Because many of you know that Dylan Roof, in his craziness, had a list of black churches that he wanted to target as potential victims of his hate crimes. And Calvary, one of our three churches united, was on that list.
That's right.
Anyway, we are really, really grateful that you're here.
Well, thanks to all three of you and to all of you for this wonderful evening and this opportunity to talk about the book. I couldn't be more thrilled to share the moment with in this beautiful church and with these three great historic congregations.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Father.
Because of who we are, let's start this evening with prayer. The Lord be with you.
With you.
But by the way, this is a prayer that I found that in some respects was used at Mother Emanuel for their gatherings and just before their Bible studies, and I've taken some liberties with it tonight. So, Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together this evening and share in the good work of your beloved Kevin. We thank you for our three churches united in the faith you have inspired in these communities for generations. We remember with reverence and respect the Emanuel Nine, who studied your word, were your faithful servants, and whose faith continues to inspire us. Bless our time together this evening. We ask for your wisdom and guidance in our discussions, that we may be united in spirit and purpose. By the gift of your grace, open our hearts and minds to your truth, and by the power of your Holy Spirit, embolden us to do the things you have given us to do, with grace and humility, that our words and actions honor you in our love and service with one another. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. So Kevin, again, welcome. For those of you who don't know, briefly, Kevin is a veteran journalist who has written about national affairs for more than 4 decades and shared in 3 Pulitzer Prizes, having spent 3 decades on the staff of the New York Times, but he has also written for the Los Angeles Times, the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and the New York Times Magazine. He is a graduate of Duke University, a native of Jacksonville, Florida, and I'm proud to say currently a resident of Charleston, South Carolina. Yep. He actually walked to the church. Yeah. He actually walked to the church.
Walking distance.
Yeah. So we're grateful for that. Yeah. And I want to thank you to Julian Buxton and Buxton Books for being so gracious to have people here tonight and sell the books. Kevin has not asked me to say this, but we're not taking it up an offering, so buy a book, okay? And he'd be glad afterwards to chat with you and sign and dedicate the book as you would like. So Kevin, we're going to maybe, the three of us, ask you some questions, and then hopefully we'll have time after about an hour of this to take questions from you all. So if you have a question, make sure to remember what it was.
Seems like the setup to a joke. 3 priests and a heathen walk, but.
Well, you're in the right place. So I've read your book a couple of times. At the very beginning of the book, even before the table of contents, you quote Dr. King's Love in Action sermon, which he gave in the 1960s, and I know the three of us are familiar with that, and maybe many people who are here tonight. And in that sermon, Dr. King said, "Forgiveness is not an occasional act. It is a permanent attitude." That was what Jesus taught his disciples. And then you later say in the book, "Forgiveness is an extension of godly grace in the human spirit. And you mentioned your witnessing of the grace extended by victims and victims' families during the legal proceedings. And your comment was, this was the purest expression of Christian grace I've ever seen. So the title of your book is actually not just Mother Emanuel, it's Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiving.
Forgiveness, right.
In one Charleston church. So I guess I just want to ask you, after you doing the interviews, after your research, just share a little bit about your notions of the necessity of forgiveness, the notion that forgiveness can be a form of resistance, and exemplified how that might be exemplified in the Black church historically and currently in our Black churches.
Sure. Well, it was really this exploration of the meaning of forgiveness within the context of this horrific event 10 years ago, last summer, that drove my 10 years of work on this book. When the killings happened at Emanuel, I came over several days later to cover the aftermath for the New York Times, and I was obviously, like everybody, deeply affected by what was going on in real time. I also quickly got fascinated by the backstory of the church and this notion that I think lives out in the book, that you can use the church as a vehicle to tell the entire or a 2-century span of African American history in this city. But it really, when the expressions of forgiveness were made in court, and there actually was a television interview the night before in which Chris Singleton, who many of us know, the son of Sharonda Singleton, made a similar remark to a television reporter who sort of thrust a mic in his face as he and his sister were walking out of a memorial service for their mom at Goose Creek High School, and said, "What are you feeling right now?" And he first, before any of the others, said, "There's nothing but love from our side of the family right now. We already forgive him for what he's done." And then, of course, the next day in the bond hearing, 5 family members, one after the next, none of them have any idea they're even going to be asked to speak, get up, come to the microphone, and in front of what ended up being a worldwide television audience, one after the next expresses forgiveness for this guy who was then, and as far as we know, is now, an utterly remorseless, unrepentant white supremacist mass murderer. I was, I think, like all of us, simultaneously awestruck by that and befuddled by it. Yes, to me it seemed the purest expression of Christianity we had ever seen. And I wanted to know what it really meant, where it came from, and decided fairly quickly that if there was a route to discovering what it really meant, it was going to be through understanding the history of this congregation and the history of its denomination. And that's really what set me off. I eventually concluded, and I devote the epilogue of the book to this whole notion, that those of us who perceive those expressions of forgiveness in court for the killer, as towards the killer, as being for the killer, probably misunderstood their intent, probably misunderstood the role that forgiveness and grace has played in the Black church, and what the history of Emanuel and the history of African Americans in the South, as told through Emanuel, helped me understand was that forgiveness has been adapted as a mechanism, almost a survival mechanism within the Black church over the generations, because let's face it, how else to get by? I interviewed all of those who forgave, and each told me that it was totally unpremeditated, unplanned. They had no idea these words were going to come out of their mouths. It was God speaking. They were merely the vessels. They also make it clear, in the next sentence, that it wasn't for him, that it was for themselves. that it was release, it was relief, it was the way you get out of bed the next day. Felicia Sanders and Polly Shepard and the others will certainly tell you that if you do not forgive, you will be so consumed by the toxicity of the rage and the fury and the frustration that the victimization is multiplied. You are sacrificed along with the victim of the crime. And so in that way, to me, the forgiveness that was expressed here really was a reclamation of agency. It was people saying, we are taking our lives back from this person who has stolen so much from us. And also in that way, I think it was its own form of resistance, in the same way that I outline one resistance tale after the next in this book, whether it's Morris Brown, who founded the church in this audacious walkout from white Methodist churches, or Denmark Vesey, whose name we all know, who led this the insurrection plot and was hung for it, or Richard Harvey Kane, who was the pastor during Reconstruction and went to Congress, B.J. Glover, who some of us may remember was the pastor during the Civil Rights Movement and led protest marches from the church. In the same way, I think these folks were quietly resisting the consequences of white supremacy that had been placed in front of them.
Wow. Brother?
So Kevin, in chapter 8, entitled Crackdown, the VC Aftermath, you write on page 125, the deconstruction of the African church, and with it, the extinction of black religious autonomy in Charleston for the next 43 years would be the most visible aftershock of the foiled insurrection plot. Now, in the history of black people in America, there have always been a backlash or response to anything that we've done to defend or define ourselves. The backlash of some elements and some people who are sympathizers of white supremacy and its principles have been agents of these responses. For instance, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in September of 1963, 1 month after the March on Washington and the speeches of John Lewis and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What parallels do you see with what happened in Charleston historically with black folks and the white reaction at that time in relation to what happened to the people who were murdered, i.e. martyred, at Mother Emanuel AME 10 years ago by Dylann Roof?
Yeah.
Although the times were different, did you or do you see similar parallels to cause such an evil response to happen?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the book is really a long, slow walk through this cyclical history of progress and then reaction to progress. And there are examples all throughout Emanuel's story. When Morris Brown led this walkout from white Methodist churches and formed his own congregation, which was very much an AME congregation from the start. They had a physical building in the neck at the corner of Hanover and Reed Streets. They were immediately harassed by the authorities who, I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, this is, 1818. They saw this as just an unthinkable act of rebellion on the part of what was primarily the enslaved community, although led to some extent by free people of color in the city. There were arrests of ministers, services were raided. The church never really got up and running in any sort of real way. And then after the Vesey revolt, I think one of the more interesting findings in the book is how close the connection was between those that were implicated in the Vesey revolt and what was then called the African church. This was the predecessor church. I was able to sort of crunch a lot of the numbers and found that fully half of those who were sent to the gallows in some way had some sort of association with the church. And that if you had an association with the church, you were twice as likely to be to be tried, to be convicted, and to be sentenced to death as those who weren't affiliated with the church. Where I'm going with all this is that after those trials, after the hangings of 35 men, including Vesey, the church was destroyed. Again, action, reaction. One of the very, very interesting finding in the research, and I wish that I could take credit for it, but I can't. The legend in this town forever has been that the church was destroyed by fire. By order of the authorities, there was this dramatic conflagration that burned the church to the ground. And any number of history books state this as fact. Barack Obama said as much in his eulogy for the victims of the Emmanuel killings. But thanks be to God for the digitization of newspapers. A history professor who was doing another book a few years back did a search of old Charleston newspapers through a database, just plugged in African church, and up popped all these ads from August 1822 newspapers from an auctioneer selling all the lumber from the African church. So didn't burn to the ground, obviously. Right. And so it leaves, you have to use your imagination a little bit to try to figure out what did happen. But what I imagine happening, and to some extent I think it's even more dramatic than the fire, is that the members of the church, the very hands that had nailed this church into place, I think probably had to dismantle it board by board. Maybe they did it after some arrangement with city officials, like, yes, we'll tear the church down and we will stop our operations, but can we at least sell the wood, and do something with the money that we had spent to build this church to begin with. Reconstruction's another example. Obviously Jim Crow follows straight on the heels of those 12 hopeful years of Reconstruction. And during the Civil Rights Movement, there was a lot of fear within the church about the response from outside to all of the activity that was being sponsored by the pastor, Reverend Glover, because of Birmingham in 1963. They were just very sensitive to the notion that, hey, you're putting our building and potentially our children at risk through these activities. So yeah, I think what we saw in 2015 was just the latest installment of this whole historical continuum.
Maybe just add before you ask the question. Since we're all three Episcopal churches and we're about being truthful about history and our own Episcopal church, when you mentioned the VC aftermath and the large predominant percentage of African Americans or blacks who were associated with the African American church were the ones that were executed or whatever. I remember in your book it struck me and I wasn't surprised by it. I think you mentioned that, but of course the rector at St. Philip's Church was wanting to make sure everybody knew that none of their blacks.
Right.
God forbid the the Episcopal Church. It was none of our blacks that were involved.
Yes, he made it clear that it was not their people. That's right.
So we're trying to rectify that.
Well, my question, Kevin, follows from all of this, and it has to do with white Christian nationalism.
Oh boy.
Something that we've lived with for a long time and are certainly seeing manifestations of today. Early on in the book, in the chapter titled Church and State, you note that 18th century Anglican missionaries in the Carolinas could often not get access to enslaved people until they promised to not subvert the power structure and control of white enslavers. As an example of this, you write that these missionaries would promise not to baptize enslaved men and women without first requiring them to swear to their understanding that baptism would not bring them freedom. Right. You write on page 47 that this was an early manifestation of competing Christian prerogatives. The missionaries could only fulfill the calling of slave conversion with the acquiescence of white enslavers. But white trust could only be gained through the corruption of Christian values. In the slave states, the churchmen realized proselytization would have to be sold as a mechanism for profitability and control. And this, to me, seems like a perfect early example of white Christian nationalism. And I wonder if you could comment in all the research that you've put in over the last 10 years, how this impulse has evolved over time in our country, and maybe how you might see that being carried forward today.
Oh, man.
Sorry.
Too bad this isn't televised.
Yeah, thank God it's not. That's a PhD thesis waiting for somebody to write it, but someone other than me. You know, I don't know what to say really other than that I agree. I was fascinated when I started researching the early history of the church by how, what's the right word, sort of how active, how volatile this whole debate was between these, these competing prerogatives of the scriptural instruction to broadcast the word widely, and the simultaneous notion that there's a lot of dangerous stuff in that book when you're talking about an enslaved population. There's all this talk about freedom and justice, and that Exodus story in particular is very, very problematic. And interestingly enough, Denmark Vesey was a real Exodus guy. I mean that he preached it, he spoke it, and as did other leaders of American slave revolts, most of whom were who did come out of the church. So there was this constant tension, and ultimately, at least before the Civil War, the prevailing force was certainly the force of security, and there were all kinds of compromises made by the church in order to maintain itself as an institution. We've got a Southern Baptist Convention. We've got Southern Methodist. Those denominations all grew out of that time period when the denominations did essentially just concede the positions they had taken on enslavement. I mean, Methodism was a starkly abolitionist faith when it first came to these shores. The Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley, the founders of the denomination, had come to Savannah, had spent time in Charleston, had experienced slavery there, write about it in their journals in really horrific ways, made an impression. And so the faith that came back over the Atlantic at the Wesleys' direction was an abolitionist faith until it became clear that they just could not attract white members in cities like Charleston. The Methodist churches here were led by very small numbers of white folks who governed large black memberships.
I would just add the observation that you see the evolution of the black church in this country as an instrument of liberation, political activism, and all too often, I believe we've seen an evolution in the white church to continue to prioritize security, right, over perceived risks of doing otherwise. Right. And I guess I would just say, and I think the three of us have talked about this before, that in my experience, all too often, politics, which is, in my estimation, simply another way of talking about the way we organize ourselves, the way people, particularly on the margins, get impacted by policies. That conversation, in my experience, is a normal part of ministry within the black church, but in the white church, that's how a clergy person gets kicked out of a job.
So in chapter 3, which is Charleston's African diaspora, free and enslaved, you mentioned that skin tone and social status differences in the mid-1800s, which, by the way, was about the same time our three churches united were formed, and the establishment of certain societies, the Brown Fellowship Society, the Friendly Moralist Society, the Humane Brotherhood, were established. And you say, for many in the moneyed class, it seemed more important and perhaps more realistic to maintain their status above the enslaved than to aspire to full citizenship. Status differences continually eroded the bonds of racial unity and turned free Negroes and slaves against each other. And then you go on to say, over the years, Charleston's black churches would not prove immune from the toxicity of caste, as the Baptists, Catholics, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, and African Methodists each established discrete congregations for their lighter skin elites. So what are your thoughts on how skin tone or colorism and social status within the African American community have played a role in Charleston's black churches?
I mean, I just think it clearly has, with the establishment of those churches early on. I think it's largely, if not totally now, dissipated. I haven't surveyed churches in any sort of formal study, but regardless of denomination, the black churches I walk into now, there's no distinction, obviously, as it should be. But I think that the early distinctions were real and sort of undeniable, and I think they were seen not only in the church, but in the city's business structure and eventually its black political structure when there was one. Obviously, Charleston's not alone in this. We've seen it in other places, including New Orleans, Atlanta, you name it. I think that there certainly was a sense. It was clearly a city during antebellum times, and this tradition followed emancipation with three distinct classes, with a controlling white class, a subordinate class of enslaved African Americans, and then this sort of middle class that was neither here nor there. Obviously significantly more freedom and rights than enslaved people, but still not fully free, of free people of color, many of whom were, for the obvious reasons, light-skinned. And we can go into the history of that. There are any number of ways that free people of color in Charleston became free, but the primary one is that they were the progeny and offspring of relationships between the enslaved and the enslaver. So, I think that it did have an effect on sort of the geographic politics of churches in the town. I think when churches divided, including when Emmanuel split off Mount Zion AME, for instance, reputedly those who went with Norman Bascom Sterrett, the founding pastor of Mount Zion, who had been the pastor at Emmanuel and who was himself extremely light-skinned, were more like him. And if you talk to, as I have, to Kylon Middleton, our county council chair and also the pastor at Mount Zion, he will tell you that when he got there, which was, I don't know, a dozen years ago maybe, there were pictures of all the pastors on the wall, and it was only the last couple who looked like him, and that he had been told by older members that a couple of generations ago this wouldn't have worked out here. So as unpleasant as it sometimes is. I think that the factuality of it is sort of undeniable, and that there was a time when it had a real impact on virtually every aspect of African American life in the city.
Wow.
Anyone disagree?
No,
Feel free to.
We get it. We get it
Okay.
in this group.
On page 278, chapter 15, Clementa Pinckney and the Paradox of Black Power, you speak of the cultural and population shift that Mother Emanuel AME had and is facing. You write, in Emanuel's heyday, virtually every family lived close enough to walk to Calhoun Street on Sunday mornings or to get there with a short bus ride. That ensured a certain generational continuity. As the black population shifted away from downtown, fewer and fewer were willing to make the trek. Younger ones stopped going altogether or gravitated to hipper megachurches that welcomed them with electronic guitars, shorter services, digestible sermons, and why y'all laughing?
Yeah. I was going to say, just like this place.
And diverse ministries, including for LGBTQ members. Now, as someone who has done intense scholarly research on a particular black church, as you have with Mother Emanuel AME, and has been able to see and hear what it was like in the old days in comparison to what is happening there now, what would be your observations for the future of the black church here in Charleston, and how the black church could remain relative and remain in a continual part of the overall lives of black Charlestonians? Yeah. Will or should the black church be the same as it has been? What is different with our young people today in comparison to the young people of the decades preceding this current period?
It's a great question.
Which one of the four of those do you want to
Yeah. I'll find three of them to ignore and just answer the other one. No, it's a very good question. I don't know that I feel qualified to talk with a lot of wisdom about the situation peninsula-wide. I do feel like I can talk somewhat about Emmanuel, which I think has a very particular set of problems that are related to what everybody else is facing, but that are nonetheless specific to Emmanuel because of its recent history. So, like a lot of black churches downtown before the shootings happened 10 years ago, it was a church in decline. The gentrification had just clobbered it. The membership was aging. The style of worship there is very conservative and very stodgy. There still is no electric guitar. The trumpeter that came in after the massacre still gets a few looks, on Sundays. And the services do go at least 2 hours long. It's a tough place to bring small children, right? It's not particularly appealing to families. Poor Reverend Manning does an altar call every Sunday, and I'm there often, and rarely does anyone answer the call. So it's just a tough situation. The building dates back to 1891, has all kinds of structural needs. During Reverend Pinckney's pastorate, they did an engineering study that found that termites and water had so eroded the trusses and the beams that it was no longer particularly safe to occupy the organ loft. They're now in the middle of the second phase of a two-part fundraising campaign to try to do the structural renovations they need. I think they had to borrow $900,000 to complete the first part. They're still paying that off. So it's with a shrinking population base, an aging population base, it's just going to be very difficult to maintain this church, and until they find a way to broaden and diversify the services and make them more appealing to newcomers and to younger members, I don't see that changing. What's different at Emmanuel than everywhere else that has these kinds of problems is Emmanuel can't leave. We've all seen other churches, and I'm sure that all three of these churches have at least had the discussion about, do we follow the population out to North Charleston or out to Goose Creek or West Ashley or wherever it's gone? And any number of churches have done it. I mentioned in the book that there's, I can't remember the name that the church used to have now on East Bay that's now a cycling studio, right? So this has been what's come of many black churches on the peninsula. But Emmanuel is literally a shrine. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. They can't go anywhere. So they're going to have to find a way to take on these dueling problems, these coexisting problems of declining membership and increasing maintenance costs. And I'm not exactly sure how they go about that. In terms of, the broader question of what black churches in Charleston can and should be doing, I think a lot of what you guys are doing. Joining together with like-minded churches, I think, has got to be helpful. Again, I'm not an expert in sort of style of worship and the music and things like that at other congregations, but I would assume that there's an understanding that the only way at this point to take members away from the mega churches, particularly younger churches, is to make things more youthful, more energetic, shorter services, more social action.
More social action.
Yeah, and I would just say I think regardless of the demographic of a congregation in this day and age, I think it is increasingly true that building the kind of relationships that our Three Churches United partnership has been about doing is, I think, essential for ministry in the 21st century because of all sorts of different demographic realities. But it is no doubt hard to be an active congregation when you are at the same time a shrine. Mother Emmanuel is right around the corner from St. Stephen's, and I'm sure we're all aware of this. You can see on any given day people stopping by and paying their respects,
and it's also obviously, something I didn't mention. It's changed the feel of the place, right? People, longtime members, many of them just want their old church back, right? They're never going to get their old church back. It's just not realistic at this point. I watched on Zoom on Sunday. I wasn't able to go, but watched, and when the pastor had the visitors rise, as usual, I'd say about a third of the people in the pews were visitors, many of them white. And people in the congregation have different views about that. Some of them think, maybe this was God's purpose. Maybe this was the silver lining, that it's bringing people into the church, exposing them to our beliefs that would not be here otherwise. And we enjoy them, and they fill up the collection plate, and there's nothing bad about it. Others that just are having trouble, accepting even 10 years later how the place has changed. And they walk in on a Sunday morning, and there's a family in the pew that they've been sitting in. Their family's been in for 50 years. That doesn't always sit so well.
It doesn't.
It's also obviously for some people, particularly people who are close to the victims, it's just a hard place to walk into.
Yeah.
You're worshiping literally one floor above a murder scene where 9 people that you knew were killed. And I know that even though I'm not a member, and obviously I didn't know anybody at the church before 2015. Now that I do know people at the church, when I'm in there, I have a hard time looking across the aisle at Blondell Gadsden and not thinking, oh, her sister, or leaning back across the pew to gossip with Willie Glee, the church historian, great guy who I'm sure many of you know, and not remembering that he's only here because he got hungry that night and went to Ruby Tuesday for dinner. Yeah, so I think it's always with you to some extent. It's hard to escape as much as the ministry there and the church does its best to just try to get back to being church. I think the ghosts are sort of always present.
Kevin, in the epilogue of the book, you allude to the way in which white Charlestonians and white Americans writ large have often seemed to want to overemphasize the act of forgiveness of the families of the Emanuel Nine and the hand-holding that happened across the bridge the day after the massacre as a way to absolve white America from the long legacy of white supremacy that produced Dylan Roof, that still prevents real progress of equity and justice on a whole range of issues. To that end, on page 347, you quote wonderful pastor, Reverend William H. Lamar IV, who on the 4th anniversary of the massacre invoked Dietrich Bonhoeffer's notion of cheap grace to speak of what white Americans so often want to reach for in emphasizing forgiveness and repentance. Grace absent the challenges of living in new ways as communities. You quote Reverend Lamar as going on to say, "I am unwilling to forgive what has happened in America until America is willing to repent and willing to atone, and America has not done that." As we find ourselves at the 10th anniversary of this massacre, I have been very aware, certainly was very aware leading up to the 17th of June this year, of a lot of conversation about how little progress has been made on justice and equity issues, and if anything, we've been going the wrong direction. Right. And I wonder if you could speak to similar frustrations, perhaps, that you heard and bore witness to as you were putting this book together and the interviews that you had.
Yeah, well, I think that, when we talk about the forgiveness that took place in the aftermath of this incident, it's important, first of all, to recognize that those folks did not by any means speak for everybody, right? Not in the community, not at Mother Emanuel, not even in their own families. There were, deep divisions within some families and over the decision by one member or another to forgive. Some of them, they continue to this day. But I think that I do think that there were, not all, but that there were a lot of white Americans who hoped that they were speaking for all of Black America, right? And in doing so were, yes, absolving us of any deeper responsibility other than the choice we made to hold hands over the bridge, with any deeper responsibility to really attack the root cause, white supremacy, and that's what created this kid. He found it on the internet, and yeah, in the aftermath, I think there was a reaction to the reaction in Charleston. First, what the family said, President Obama sort of cemented it into place with his eulogy, which was all about the power of forgiveness in the Black church and its meaning in the Black church. And it's interesting, there were a lot of writers, people like Roxane Gay, who came out afterwards and said, we're tired of being the ones that forgive. Why is it always on us to forgive? And as with Bonhoeffer's notion of cheap grace, that this forgiveness becomes meaningless to some extent if it's not accompanied by Christian acts, right? If it's not accompanied by some effort to make the world a better place, and in particular in this case, with regard to attacking white supremacy. So.
Well, and when the four of us met ahead of this event to talk, we were mentioning the apology that the city of Charleston issued for its role in the slave trade that passed 7-5. It was a 7-5 vote. Right. And then, of course, the long document that was put together painstakingly by a commission of people to try to help our city government address racial inequity on a whole range of issues effectively was rendered toothless at the end by our city council. I briefly served on the what is now called Human Affairs and Racial Conciliation Commission, and there are a whole range of things that the commission just could not mention or talk about, like reparations, for instance. It just couldn't come out of the commission, and that is in the code that the city government put into the founding document.
Which isn't to say, I think, that there weren't important things that came out of this. I mean, yes, they were symbolic, but I don't think it's mutually exclusive that something can be symbolic and significant. Yeah, I think the flag coming down mattered. Sure. Should it have taken 9 deaths, including that of a state senator, in 2015 for a flag that had been up since 1961? Obviously not. Same with the Calhoun statue. And I think that there were lots of conversations that started in this town that did not happen previously. Julian Buxton is here. He and Polly started their bookstore largely as a place to be a vehicle for such conversations. So, I sort of make the argument in the book that Charleston, I think, is a different place now than it was before this incident, that it's almost like New York and 9/11. There was a Charleston before and a Charleston after. But yes, I certainly agree that whether because of the forgiveness narrative or just because the problems are so entrenched in our politics, are so polarized, and there's just not enough will, that the good feelings that came after this incident certainly did not translate into any sort of meaningful assault on the problems we all know exist in the lack of equity, and whether it's economics or housing or the environment or water or all the problems of education, law enforcement, all the problems we face in this town.
So as we move closer to 7 o'clock, because I know we want to leave time for questions, let me just ask one last question up here. Your epilogue is titled Forgiveness and Grace. And you start that epilogue with the sentence, "Black Charlestonians have had a lot to forgive." Then you recount almost 400 years of history and end it with saying, "The weight of it all, the duration of it all, takes your breath away." You later say, "Given the ongoing trauma, members of Mother Emanuel have every reason to be wary of white people." And frankly, in light of the history of Black Charlestonians have experienced, perhaps we can all agree on that. But then you acknowledge a truth which honestly touched my heart, because I've spent a lifetime coming to it myself, and you say, "I've endeavored to tell the congregation's story in a way that reciprocates the respect, recognizing that my own race, background, and privilege make it impossible for me to experience or understand it in the way that African Americans do." So, what should us, white privileged Americans that are sitting here in this group, take away from your book, you think, in 2025?
Well, I don't think you can read this book and not conclude that there's such a thing as systemic racism in this country, and always has been. So I don't shy away from that assertion, and I think that's really the message. I mean, I spend 350 pages reviewing 200 years in which it's just moment after moment after moment in which this congregation had to surmount the worst kind of white supremacy and the impact of it. So, I think the message is that the sooner that we accept this, the better. I didn't have any sense for what the political climate in this country would be, needless to say, at the time that I started writing the book. what it would be when the book was published. But I do feel like this book and books like it, I hope will be seen as an antidote to this accelerating attack on actual American history that we see both at the national and at many state levels. What are we so scared of? The truth, I just don't get it. It's just vital to not only to understanding our past, but to giving context to our present. And, I think it's prerequisite to having the kind of just and equitable future that we were talking about, at least if we decide that that's what we're interested in anymore. So, the message to take away, I hope, is that this is real history, both the glorious and the inglorious parts of it, and it's our shared history. And it doesn't matter a damn when your people got here or who they were or what their views were when they got here, what their precise role might have been. It's all of our history now, and we're only moving past it if we come to accept that.
Well, let me applaud you for that, Steve. Anyone have any questions of Kevin? Ricardo and Adam are going to make their way out with microphones. Please,
Adam
don't be
has
shy.
this side, I have this side.
Don't be shy.
What was the most impactful thing that you learned during your research for the book?
Impactful. Boy, it's hard to narrow it down to one. I guess can I sort of recast the question as sort of what was the discovery that, was the most aha moment? How about that? And it was kind of fantastic, but I spent a lot of time at the Recorder of Deeds office in the county building, looking for the original deeds for purchase of property, both for the original church on Charleston Neck, which I found dated back to 1818, and the existing church on the existing site at 110 Calhoun in 1865. So found that deed, and it's handwritten in these huge, musty volumes, just like it's supposed to be, when you're doing archival work. And I take photographs and I take notes, and it's incredibly useful because it's got names. It's got the names of the trustees, the original trustees of the church, who I can then go and do genealogical searches on and figure out who they were and where they came from. Also had the name of the seller of the property, which was a guy named George Alfred Trenholm, who, being a relative newcomer to the area, I had never heard of, but Googled it. Ends up that George Alfred Trenholm was the last Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederate States of America. And the story that I go on to dig up is that at the end of the war, he, like other Confederate leaders, flee Richmond. They're captured, they're jailed. He's placed at Fort Pulaski near Savannah. He's very sick. Trenholm had been one of the wealthiest men in the South. He had expansive interests in shipping, cotton, major slave owner, banking, you name it. During the war, his ships were used to run the blockades, and his company was a major conduit between the South and London. Anyway, in fact, so wealthy and sort of swashbuckling that there are literary sleuths who think that he was the model for Rhett Butler. Anyway, he's now jailed, he's ill, his financial empire is crumbling, and he's got to sell assets. So he instructs an agent to sell that piece of property on Calhoun Street, winds up being sold to the trustees of the first black church in Charleston, South Carolina. So quite an amazing reversal of fortunes, right? Cool story.
It is.
Thanks to the four of you for enlightening us. This has been not only enlightening, but inspiring.
No.
I am reminded about how often Martin Luther King Jr. Talked about forgiveness. I'm also reminded that Martin Luther King said, "You don't have to win the fight, but you have to let them know that they can't mess with you."
Right.
So the question is, with these two apparently opposing forces, is it important that we find a way not only for them to coexist, but to work to our advantage?
Oh, boy.
Good question.
I got to be honest, right now, I'm leaning a little more towards the resistance part of the equation than the forgiveness part of the equation. And I think that at least that the resistance piece needs to come first. Let's put it that way. Both words are in the subtitle of the book. And I don't think that necessarily means that they have to be working simultaneously. I think there may be an order. And so, I mean, I encourage us to all resist in any way that we can. I think that part of the problem, part of what I feel, I assume a lot of others do too, regardless of what your politics are, is just the volume of stuff coming at us right now, right? And I think it's intentional, that we be overwhelmed to the point that we're sort of paralyzed into inaction. And the only approach that I know of that can be used to combat that is to sort of pick your spots, right? Find a place where you think you can make a difference and go do it. And so for the few months that I'm spending of my life promoting the book, I'm trying to pick that spot of arguing that we need to understand our actual history and combat the efforts that are being made to diminish it and erase it. I don't know if that answers your question, but. Yeah.
No one else? There we go. Up here. And Adam, there's one up here too. Up.
This gentleman here.
Did you have someone, Ricardo? No? Okay. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Prior to coming to the lecture, I did a quick Google search on Dylan Roof, and I was surprised to learn that he was tried, of course, convicted, and sentenced to death. But as we speak, he's alive and well on death row. What meaning or significance do you attach to that?
Let me, before you, I won't even answer your question, but I was going to bring this up as we conclude anyway. When we had our lunch with Kevin last week, just by chance at the end, he mentioned something that, and if you would answer that question, but share this. Kevin's actually had direct communication with Dylan Roof by letter while he's currently on death row.
Yeah.
And I think we need to recognize, if you'll share what you share with us, it's simply chilling. So answer that question, but would you share some of what you shared with us, because it's mind-blowing.
So the background is, yes, he's on death row in Terre Haute, Indiana, at a federal penitentiary there. You may remember his trial was just as bizarre as they come, because he actually sidelined his defense team, and I covered the trial for the Times, excuse me. He sidelined his defense team because he did not want there to be any evidence presented that would persuade either the jury or the outside world that that this had been anything other than an utterly premeditated act. And he knew that his defense lawyers were going to present a psychiatric defense if they could. It was the only way they had, the only hope they had of persuading one juror to not send them to death row. Roof got the Judge Gergel, Richard Gergel, to agree to let him represent himself during the second phase of the trial, sidelined his own lawyers, presented no defense whatsoever other than a brief opening and closing statement. And the jury spent so little time deciding on the death penalty that they sent out for lunch beforehand so that it wouldn't look like they had, only taken an hour and it would, So that said, he winds up on death row. There were until December 40 inmates on federal death row. He's now one of 3 because President Biden commuted the sentences of the other 37 from death to life. His company on death row is now the Boston Marathon bomber and the Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue shooter. So he's in rare company. And despite the fact that he basically ensured his own death sentence, yes, he is now fighting that death sentence through the appellate process, which all of us are subsidizing. He's got federal public defenders working on it. They're 10 years into the process. He has failed at every level, including the Supreme Court. There are other steps still to be taken. In terms of the timetable, it's a little bit hard to know, but I don't know that I would want to be any of these 3 guys during the remaining 3.5 years of the Trump administration. So he and I had an exchange of letters, 2 letters going each way. It's been about 5 years, so I can't really speak for his mindset now. But in those letters, he was, yes, totally remorseless and defiant and kind of juvenile, I must say. Spent a lot of the time sort of taking jabs at me as if the goal here was to sort of establish his power in our relationship. And we talked at lunch the other day, I eventually called him on all this and sort of said, I'm not in it for this. I've got a couple of very specific questions about timeline and about intent and what he knew about the church going in. And you can either answer them or not, but I'm kind of not in this to play these games. And it was journalistic malpractice because that ended the exchange of letters, needless to say. But the most telling piece of the exchange, and I think what Father's referring to, is one of the details that I wanted to ask him about, and it takes a little bit of a wind-up, but on the night of the shootings, Bible study typically would have started at 6 p.m. That night, there was what was known as a quarterly conference. People who are familiar with the Methodist or the AME Church will know that every 3 months, the presiding elder comes by the church for a business meeting. There are a prescribed series of questions that are asked. How many baptisms, how many deaths, how many marriages, financial questions. There's a process, there's a method. This is where the word comes from. And that meeting set back the start of Bible study by almost 2 hours. The Bible study didn't start till basically 8 o'clock. The reason this is relevant is that Ruth had staked out the church 6 times before the night of the attack. We know this because of the GPS data that law enforcement was able to extract from his car. And on one of these visits, he told the FBI in his confession interview the day of his arrest that he had stopped in front of the church and had asked a lady there, about the church and the times of the services, and she had explained when Bible study started. So despite the fact that he thinks that Bible study starts at 6, he didn't leave his home near Columbia until almost 6:15 for what then was almost a 2-hour drive down to Charleston, right? Makes no sense. So I asked him about this, how do you explain this, what was going on here? And his response was, well, there's always divine intervention. So that's his mindset. He said, I think he also said there were 1,000 reasons that somebody like him might do what he had done, and that he didn't think that he should be considered such a bad guy.
Father Schaefer.
Yes, sir.
Real quick, when we had the lunch last week with Kevin, I mentioned to him that we had a training with the Absalom Jones Center from Atlanta over at St. James Episcopal Church. And one of the things that happened, there was a video that we all looked at of a white nationalist, a neo-Nazi, who said, you know, how he became involved with the whole neo-Nazi movement. But one of the things that he said was that he was involved with the neo-Nazi rock band, you know, the music and everything that's on part of it. And part of the aspect of his own repentance, and as well as seeking reconciliation, is that he said that it was documented that Dylan Roof listened to his music and was radicalized by it and was listening to it as he was driving down here to Charleston. And he said that part of his repentance and regret is that even though he was not there at Mother Emanuel here in Charleston when it happened, he, through his own hate, somehow influenced as well as played a part in that whole thing going on. I don't know if the folks at the training remember this, but when I saw that and I heard that, it really struck me, because one of the things you hear about Dylan Roof is that he did not get the classical white supremacist training. He didn't go to Klan Camp 101 or stuff like that. You know, he was radicalized online by way of what you hear, so on and so forth. So to hear that was really eye-opening for me.
Yeah, the trial was deeply unsatisfying in terms of supplying answers that we all wanted. Of, you know, who is this kid, and how did this happen, and how do you become radicalized like this online? I mean, because of his ability to control the narrative of the trial, we just didn't get a lot of that. You know, something that was interesting, though, was that before the trial, there were a series of competency hearings held, closed door, no press, in which the judge was trying to determine whether this guy was in fact competent to stand trial and then competent to represent himself. Even though that was, those documents were all sealed and the hearings were behind closed doors, after the verdict, Judge Gergel unsealed all that material, and I was able to study it. And it included psychiatric reports, both by defense experts and by plaintiffs' experts. And, you know, they didn't come up with a lot more than we already knew in terms of the specifics about how he went down this internet rabbit hole and sort of never emerged. You know, the story is that he first got interested after the Trayvon Martin incident, and he Googles black on white crime, and it takes him to some white supremacist website that's spewing all sorts of false statistics about you know, black perpetrator of white rape victim incidents, things like that. And this sort of just, he seizes on this stuff and he can't get rid of it. Well, in these psychiatric reports, there were conclusions by the experts that, yeah, he had some sort of mild diagnoses, some social anxiety and things like that. But there also was a pretty firm conclusion that he had undiagnosed autism from at least from his teenage years. And there was a lot of attention to this in the hearings. And I read all the reports, and you think, well, you know, okay, so he's autistic. There are plenty of autistic people in the world, and presumably including autistic white supremacists who don't take the next step, right, of staking out a church, buying a weapon as soon as you turn 21, and walking into Bible study and killing 9 people. But what one of the experts did say was that once he seized on white supremacy, once whatever happened took hold that made, that sort of gave order to his disordered world through white supremacist thinking, that he latched on to it with an autistic focus. And that, I thought, made a certain amount of sense. That it doesn't explain how he got to the mindset that he got to, but it may explain to some extent how he couldn't escape it.
All right, anyone else? Okay, come on up, guys. So I want to thank all of you for being here. Those of you who are not members of the three churches, we're open for business. And for those of you who are, thank you for being here. There's a number of clergy here tonight. We're grateful for each of the clergy. And our canon for justice, Canon Ramel McCall, is here, and we're so grateful for Ramel, your presence. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank all of you.
I will tell you, if you have not read his book, and you care about history, and you care about Charleston, and you care about what the real truth is, what the real history is, and issues of how we can resist, read his book. It's here. Julian Buxton, thank you for helping us tonight. It's in the back. I know he'll be able to do it. And my friend, you have not been paid anything for this, and we have very little to give you. But I will tell you that the fact that you wrote a book, because it's important to tell the truth in history as it is, and your comments about your desire, wherever you will be, to maybe promote resistance in any way we can do it. It's not much, but our three churches united have a patch, which none of you have seen yet. It'll be on our stole yet.
Right here.
And we want to give you this.
Thank you.
You can use it as a coaster or whatever. But you now are an official member of the three churches.
I love that. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming and for your interest in the book. It means the most to me. Thank you so much.
Say that again.
I just wanted to say thanks again to all of you for coming and for your interest in the book. It just means everything to me. So thanks.
I will tell you, you're pretty smart. He had a session set at the Charleston Literary Festival. It sold out, so they moved it to Mother Emanuel. It sold out. So we're lucky, very lucky, that Kevin did this for us. So thank you.
Thanks all of you. Appreciate it. That was great, Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks so much,
This is
man.
wonderful.
Really enjoyed it.